Hello, good morning, Clive. It's nice to have you here. You are the director of the film Freetown that we are very honored to have at our 40th FIFA programming this year. I have some questions for you. I could talk about your film all day long, but we have only 10 to 15 minutes. So I would start with I would ask you, how would you describe the story of your film in your own words, very shortly?
Freetown is the story of two men in Sierra Leone, West Africa, who are trying to do something or create a work of theatrical art that they hope is going to reframe the story, the narrative of their nation. Their country has gone through a lot in recent decades. It's suffered a lot, and it suffered a lot from also very negative kind of media narratives. And so they want to try and excavate their nation from, I guess, this sort of negativity with a kind of new work of theatrical art. But the whole story takes a range of twists and turns, and it goes into unexpected places. There's quite a lot of tension and conflict that arises. So ultimately, there's a lot more going on thematically, historical resonance. But ultimately, it's a story about these two men and their friendship and this journey they go on.
Great. How did you start this relationship with the journalist Sergio Zamora? How did everything started for you?
So I have been working with Sorius for over a decade. I first met him, 2008 actually, and basically we spent a lot of time working for the same company, and that company makes documentaries. We did a lot of work together in Africa. He was often the reporter, and I was the director and the producer, and we made quite a large number of films together across the continent of Africa, telling current affairs stories. So I knew him well as a colleague and as a friend, and obviously, he remains a very good friend to this day.
Of course. At what time did you say to yourself, I have to do this film? This is a film I want to do, and I want to tell this story. At what point did you arrive there?
I mean, one of the things about Sorius that I became familiar with, spending a lot of time with him, and especially the work that we were doing. So a lot of our films, current affairs films, were, I guess, about things happening in Africa that were basically sort of bad news stories. These are kind of tragedies or stories about corruption, stories about hunger, stories about the Ebola crisis, stories about homophobia. So I guess one thing that Sorius was very conscious of and was also kind of sick and tired of, was what he felt was this kind of ongoing fixation with kind of disaster stories from the continent of Africa. And I mean, I had seen this growing in him, this kind of growing sense of frustration, I guess, at the culture of, I guess, media reporting on the continent. And, on a personal level, I mean, my journey in Africa was very much alongside him. I kind of, my knowledge of the continent and my relationship with the continent grew alongside him and my work with him, but also was informed by his perspective on things, for sure. I also, really loved I mean, I love a lot of the places that I've been to, and there's so much more to show about African history and culture and society that you do start to feel quite jaded about, I guess, the appetite when it comes to the type of stories that people seem to be more interested in, or at least interested in commissioning from like broadcasters. So this was something that had been brewing in Sorius. And so when he started talking about the idea of partnering with his friend Charlie, who I'd met by this point and who I thought was this fascinating figure of his own. I mean, he's this great character and this sort of mercurial artist, very charismatic, clearly had a tremendous impact in his own country. And interestingly, he'd kind of made a career of doing almost the opposite of what Soros had been doing. He'd made a career of kind of celebrating his country's culture and also his region's culture. And so Soros wanted to do something that was going to, I guess, help him overcome that sense of kind of guilt in a way, that he was really perpetuating these same negative stereotypes. And I think probably that the moment that I really felt like, wow, this is an amazing story and it comes from a really personal place, it was when he told me about being a child and how he used to get so angry about the way that he saw his country and his continent being portrayed on the TV, that he, used to throw stones at Western journalists because he'd see them in the street and he'd just assume that they were there to kind of like pick on these negative sides of the country. And so literally throwing stones at, white Western journalists. And then for him to end up basically kind of becoming that object of hate, that he ended up doing the same thing and telling the same stories and perpetuating the same narratives, that he needed to kind of like redress that, and that was the seat of this frustration. And that felt like a really rich personal journey that he was going on. And I was very quick to say, well, I want to come on this journey with you, Soros.
Yes, I see. I wanted to ask you, how was it for you to observe this whole entire process of washing or cleaning up the image of an entire country, if not an entire continent? How was it for you to be part of that?
It's kind of a hard question because, it was quite an intense journey. There was a lot going on ultimately through the course of the film. It was very emotional. It was quite stressful because, as the film shows, it wasn't just an easy, lovely, simple task of telling a joyous story about Sierra Leone. Actually, ultimately, they're confronted with many of the difficulties and inherent challenges of not only the country, but of themselves and of their own kind of personal problems, that actually the project somehow ends up revealing aspects of their own personal stories and their own personal prejudices and their own difficulties and their relationship with their country and their relationship with the continent. And it ends up becoming a complex story and a complex multi-layered journey. I love both of these men. I think they're both heroes. And I had a huge amount of respect and admiration for the integrity of their journey and the integrity of what they were trying to do. But ultimately, I feel the film is more interesting and more rich and complex because it isn't just about happy celebration. And that actually there are all these different shades that reveal themselves and make the journey much more complicated and difficult than they could have anticipated.
Of course, and at this point we see that for Soros there is a turning point where he found himself between his identity and the outsider effect. It's like he doesn't really know where he belongs to, and he's fighting against himself and the image he wants to give of his country, but at the same time he's kind of trapped in this willing. How was it? I mean, what would you say? Is it this uncomfortable identity where you're kind of trapped in the same cliches that you're trying to clean up or trying to change the image? How did you experience that with him?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the core of the film in a way. The film, in my mind, is ultimately about identity and reconciling identity, and that's at a personal level, particularly with Soros, but it's also reflected at a national level. And so, you have this amazing scene at the end of the road trip where Charlie and Soros are both being very reflective after they've met the chief. And Charlie is there commenting on how, we as Sierra Leoneans or we as Africans are lost people. we're caught somewhere between our traditional identity and this kind of Western identity that's been somehow implanted or encouraged through the process of colonialism, but then even after that. So, and Soros, of course, talking about we used to have our own religion. Like, where did it go? Now it's just Islam and Christianity, and they're not our religions. And so that kind of sense of tension in terms of the Sierra Leonean identity and the Sierra Leonean predicament being caught between these sort of different forces, Soros basically inhabits that at a personal level. And being an expat in the UK, having been westernized himself to a large degree, but also very much rooted in his own country and trying to explore that and express it, he finds himself at that same crossroads and at that same tension. And really, the way in which those two things reflect each other, the personal and the national, the kind of micro and the macro, I mean, to me, that felt like the heart of the film. And even in that scene, in that bedroom, I knew then there was something very interesting about the atmosphere in the room that night and the way they were talking about identity. And because I knew that Soros inhabited these same issues, that it felt like a very rich sort of space, and that kind of relationship between the personal story and the broader national story just felt like it was very organic. But ultimately, I can relate to it to an extent. I'm half Japanese. I was born in Japan, raised in the UK, but very much, raised with both cultures. And I kind of also, that's one level on which I could really relate to Soros and could relate to his journey. And ultimately, it's very funny. I mean, it's tragic and it's full of different emotions, but there's also a kind of humor in it. And I think the humor in the film shouldn't be forgotten and shouldn't be lost. And I think probably one of my favorite scenes is when Soros is waiting for these tickets. That the tickets are finally supposed to come, and he's waiting, and 2 hours pass, and the tickets still haven't arrived. And he's basically, going mad because everything in Sierra Leone is so slow and everything's so disorganized, and people promise to come and they never come. And suddenly he realizes that he's kind of being this kind of white man. He's kind of like the sort of the work ethic of time, and everything should be done efficiently and on time. And it all comes out in this kind of like comedic moment, which I thought was, it's one of my favorite scenes actually.
Can you relate to your personal story, or maybe do you have at some point some troubles with identity between these two cultures yourself, or did it change something in your perspective about identity, this film?
Well, I think what it made me think really is that this, I guess, combination of identities, which some people can relate to, is only going to increase over time. I mean, the world is more and more migratory. There are more and more people traveling all over the place. There are more and more multicultural countries and multicultural relationships. And more people will find themselves in that situation where they feel like they have two homes, or they feel like they have two countries or two identities. I mean, my children are, I'm half Japanese, half British. My wife is half Rwandan, half Ugandan. So, they're a kind of pretty wild mix, and they have 3 continents and 3 countries that they can kind of call their home. And so, I only have to look at them to realize that this is a conversation that's going to evolve over coming years and decades. And I think on that level, the film has quite a rich sort of story to tell.
Of course. I saw that you produced a film last year called So Full as Sky about Yes. Would you say only one word about this film, and then what are your next projects? What would that be?
Well, I mean, So Foul the Sky is an incredible work of cinematic art by my good friend Alvaro Pulpero, set in Venezuela. It's a meditative, reflective, dark road trip kind of into the soul of the country, but also into, I guess, the crisis which is unfolding there. It's really a very interesting piece of cinematic kind of poetry in a way. And that's doing well on the festival circuit, and very proud of that film. And coming up, there are a couple of feature-length documentaries which are in production, which I'm producing. I can't say too much about them, but they'll be out next year, and looking forward to those.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. I hope we have a great festival with your film in it, and we will enjoy your film during the entire festival. I hope to see you soon, and thank you very much for your words.
Well, thank you for selecting the film, and I hope your audience enjoy it.
Of course, they will. Bye. Thank you, Clive. Bye.
Bye.